All right. So good evening and good afternoon or good morning to everyone who's joining us from around the world. I'm Sheldon Xie, the research fellow at the Center for Globalization Hong Kong, CGHK. And it is my honor to welcome you all tonight, whether you are watching from Zoom or jumping in our live. Or tonight's CGHK Inside Dialogue, the Trump's reciprocal tariffs and the rise of semi-globalizations. First, let me introduce CGHK for a while. So we committed to foster a high-level independent dialogue on the world's most pressing issues, and also we will have to conduct the research for the entrepreneurs at this Hong Kong-based think tank. And our mission is to bridge academia, policy, and private sectors together and providing a platform for our robust exchange and also forward-looking insights. So tonight's discussion will not only could not be more timely. So in the past few weeks, President Trump's administration has launched the most aggressive tariff campaign in the modern history, imposing up to 245 duties on Chinese imports and targeting dozens of the major economies. So China has responded with its own swiping tariffs, reaching as high as 125% and restricting rare earth exports. So the EU and other partners has announced multiple rounds of the countermeasures, as we can see in the past few weeks on the breaking news. So the global stock market has been tumbled, and we're witnessing the sharpest test of globalization since the end of the Cold War. I can say that. It's really shocking. So what at stake is not just a trading dispute, but the very architecture of the global economy. Trump's reciprocal tariffs are accelerating a shift away from traditional multilateralism. So we see countries and regions like Europe, ASEAN, and others moving to de-risk or strengthening their regional ties and embrace what many are calling a new era of semi-globalizations. So for the first time, the U.S. is at risk of isolating itself from the system it once led, while China, despite facing economy headwinds at home so far, is seizing the opportunity to deepen the ties with other major economies. So meanwhile, both Washington and Beijing are locked in a high-stake game of endurance and pride. So a recent report shows that each side were searching each other pain points, and both leaders will face a powerful domestic pressure and stand firm. So the question is not just who will blink first, but whether the world can avoid a prolonged period of economic fragmentation and strategic rivalry. So to help us to unpack this drastic changes, we have honor to have two distinguished panelists. First of all, we have Professor Shending Li, the professor and former associate dean at the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University and the former director of the Center for American Studies. Professor Shen is one of China's most respected experts on the international security, U.S.-China relations, and global governance. The other one, we have Dr. Joshua Melzer, the senior fellow in the Brookings Institution's Global Economy and Development Program, and the former World Bank consultant on trade and privacy matters. Dr. Melzer is a leading authority on international trade, digital economy, and U.S.-China relations. And his insights are regularly thought by policymakers worldwide. So I encourage all the participants to engage actively. Please share your questions in the chat box, and also when we move to the discussion and Q&A, they will pick it up and answered by our panelists. There is a unique opportunity to explore how the new tariffs war and the shifting global order and the rise of semi-globalization will shape the business, policy, and the society in the years ahead. So thank you for joining us at this critical moment, Dr. Melzer and also Professor Shen. Let's begin our dialogue. And right now, I will give both of you to have like 7 to 10 minutes opening remarks, and you can have sharing your initial thoughts on the Trump's reciprocal tariffs, and also China's reactions and other countries' countermeasures. And then we will have some guided discussion from both of you. So, Dr. Moser, I will start starting from you. Yeah.
Sure. So look, great to be here, and obviously critical and important times, and this topic is central to what everyone is focusing on at the moment. So what I just thought I might do briefly is just outline what Trump has done so far, try to touch on what I think are some of the goals of what they're trying to achieve and what this might mean for particularly US-China relations, but I also want to touch on some of the US relations with other key trading partners as well. I'm sure the audience participants are well aware of this, but just worth recounting that when he first came into office, he initially actually focused his tariffs on Canada and Mexico, with who the US has a trade agreement, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, and which are actually its largest trading partners. And this was initially done, so he said, to stop flows of fentanyl and illegal immigrants, which has been a genuine issue at the border with Mexico, much less so with Canada. And, the reason in part for raising these issues was a combination of they are real issues with Mexico, but also the authority that he has been relying on to do these tariffs, which is the National Economic Emergency Powers Act, IEPA, requires the administration essentially to declare a state of emergency and before it can kind of take these types of actions. And so fentanyl and illegal immigration was sort of seen, I think, also as a legal basis for doing what they're doing. It is worth noting that IEPA is being now challenged on multiple fronts in the US courts. So initially we had threats of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, then pauses on those tariffs, and these tariffs essentially what we saw initially was then a couple of global sectoral tariffs. One is still on aluminum, which are in place 25%. One on automotives, 25%, except when it comes to North America, it's only on non-US content. Then we saw also 20% tariffs on China. So that was the beginning of what's been a very significant ratcheting up of tariffs on China. And just to cut a long story short, as we know, tariffs are now 145% on imports from China. So it's essentially, if you take that as a top line figure and assume it's going to stay, that is a complete decoupling of the US and Chinese economies. It's probably unlikely that's going to stay, and we're already seeing the administration granting exemptions to these tariffs. So I think that they're going to be somewhat pragmatic, and this may be rolled back in the event that the US-China do start talking bilaterally about what they can do to do a deal. In addition, then we saw that the Trump administration started rolling a lot of these threats on Canada and Mexico into this broader announcement of reciprocal tariffs, which happened on the 2nd of April. But that's when this sort of infamous list of tariffs came out, essentially based on, the trade deficit, divided by imports. And so it was a formula which really didn't have anything to do with non-tariff barriers or tariffs that the other countries had in place. And it was, I think it's come out that they essentially did it this way just so they could kind of gin up a formula to have high tariffs on other countries. And I think the theory of the case from the Trump administration perspective is to go big on tariffs as a way of sort of destabilizing countries in a negotiating sense, and sort of a shock and awe approach, with the idea that this is a great negotiating tactic, and then you bring it back down. But obviously, like, the announcement led to very significant market turmoil, drops in the stock market, the rising yields in the bond market, which was seen as very unusual, because normally during a time of financial turmoil, money crowds into the US dollar, and you actually see long-term bond yields decline, not increase. So there was actually a signal coming that the risk premium in the US was actually going up enough that people didn't want to invest in the US any longer. So I think a lot of this led to ultimately the administration, and Trump in particular, blinking, so to speak, and putting a 90-day pause on these reciprocal tariffs as they now negotiate bilateral trade deals, but not with respect to China. So China tariffs remain, and then they kind of got ratcheted up, and China followed a lot of those tariff increases. So we're now at a point where I think China tariffs on US imports are 125%, US tariffs on Chinese imports are 145%, and that's sort of where they are at until they can kind of move further on that front. The thing that did stick was a 10% global tariff, which was also announced as part of the reciprocal trade deal. So let me come back. I'll come back briefly to what I think all this means for China, US, and also a couple of other key partners. Everyone got hit, right? So the reciprocal tariffs were 20% on the EU, for instance, very significant tariffs on Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan. So whether you are a friend, an ally, everyone, Australia got hit with the 10% global tariff, even though they've got a trade surplus. The US has a trade surplus with Australia. The UK got hit with a 10% global tariff, even though the US has a trade surplus with the UK. So everyone got a tariff of some sort. And so what are they trying to do here? So there are sort of three theories, I think, of the case, so to speak. One is negotiating leverage in order to negotiate sort of better trade deals with various countries. These trade deals would, depending on the country, I think not just be about trade, but also security issues. I think the other thing that's been happening is that the administration has increasingly been looking to tariffs as a source of revenue to offset the very significant tax cuts that they're looking to try to get through Congress. And, there's also been this idea that we need tariffs to bring manufacturing back to the United States. These goals are clearly in tension with each other. The more you put tariffs up, the less you import, the lower your tariff revenue. But if you're going to do a trade deal, then you obviously are going to have to lower tariffs. So these two things don't exist together necessarily. If you want to bring back manufacturing jobs and you think you need tariffs for that, then again, you need to keep tariffs on for really extended periods to send an adequate signal to businesses that they can make investment decisions based on these types of tariffs. So I think this reflects also differing views within the administration about what they're trying to achieve here and what the role of tariffs are. When it comes to, so we're in this 90-day period now where the US is negotiating. All we're getting at the moment is signals that the discussions with Japan, which has sort of started, are going well. I think that the administration is going to want to deliver a pretty good outcome with Japan quickly to sort of show, politically and economically the markets that this is going to actually produce something of value. I think there's a lot of skepticism that this is actually going to be in any way net positive for the US. So I think there's a lot of pressure on them to deliver. I think the risks, obviously, is that Japan knows this, and so it's not a great negotiating position to be starting at, but that's where we're at. So what does this mean? What's the end game look like here? I think that I think the US-China trade, economic, strategic, and other kind of relationships, are continually heading in a direction of more tension, more competition, more decoupling of the two economies. I think even in the event that there is some bilateral discussion that seeks to sort of wind down some of these tariffs in a more pragmatic way, it's hard to see this trajectory changing in any meaningful direction. I don't think what China ultimately wants from the US in terms of US export restrictions on critical minerals, for instance, is going to move, is that the US is going to move on these types of technology issues either. So I don't think the space for any major deal is all that wide. I think that there's a strong bipartisan position on China, which also I think means that even if Trump himself wanted to maybe move a bit on that, I think he's going to feel quite constrained by politics and Congress and others. So I see US-China relationships sort of continuing in a fairly negative direction. I think one of the very important implications, what does this mean for countries in Southeast Asia that are very much part of integrated supply chains with China, but are also selling a lot into, the US market, into the European market, and so forth. And so how I think the US is beginning to think a lot more carefully about, if we're going to have long-term high tariffs on China, there's always this issue of circumvention where Chinese products are still entering the US market via countries in Southeast Asia, even Mexico and so forth. And so then how do you sort of guard against this type of circumvention? So that brings in other countries the issue is going to be bilateral, but it very much expands beyond that. I think that North America is interesting in that the reciprocal tariffs on 2nd of April did not include Mexico and Canada. And in fact, there's still about half the trade, even once you look at the global tariff on autos and on steel and aluminum, about half the trade across North America is still at zero tariffs. So that and the fact that there were no further tariffs on 2nd of April, I think sends a signal that they want to come back to the negotiating table. There's to be a review of the agreement by middle of next year. But I think once Canadian elections are over, we're probably going to get into a negotiation about USMCA shortly thereafter. And, you know, it's possible we're going to see a new deal emerging that's going to, you know, make some changes to the current agreement in some critical sectors, but also will bring in other security issues, including, you know, particularly when it comes to Canada around NATO and defence spending and cooperation probably in the Arctic, critical mineral access, which is seen as a real vulnerability in North America given China's dominance of that supply chain. But we'll also sort of really seek to, I think, bring North America alignment on China. I think the key, you know, outcome here for the rest of the world and starting with North America is that there's going to be sort of trade and economic choices that countries are going to be confronting in a much sharper way in terms of, you know, whether you sort of are aligning with the US approach to China or not. And some countries will be able to sort of, I think, have a bit of a third way because it will matter less. But I think for Canada and North America, if they're going to be part of a North American trading regime with a lot of free flow of goods and services, then it's going to be, I think, particularly important from a US perspective that there is no circumvention of this by Chinese products entering that market through Canada and Mexico. So I think we're going to see a lot more alignment by Mexico and Canada on their approach to China as well. Let me stop there. There's a lot I could go on about, but I think it's a good place to stop and over to the professor and questions afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, this really great opening remarks, and thank you, Dr. Melzer. And I believe that you're pretty right on a lot of things. Especially, I have seen every country has been hit by Trump's tariffs, and you can see like even no kind of countries have some kind of leverage or advantage by this, except like Canada and Mexico, as you pointed out, they were exceptions, and we will see how that goes. And I also have some follow-up question, but I will keep that, and then I will turn to Professor Shen to starting your initial remarks. Professor Shen, it's your turn. Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Mm-hmm. And I have enjoyed the speech of Dr. Melzer. I enjoyed. We are supposed to discuss globalization, half globalization. So let me say what it means to me, the content of globalization. To me, globalization means making the best use of a combination of the elements of productivity. American technology, Japan's financial resource, Taiwan's management skill, and mainland China's labor and its overall production structure. So therefore, American can use the cheaper priced Chinese labor. For instance, when I finished my postdoc at Princeton in 1991, more than 30 years ago, my monthly salary in China in terms of US dollar was merely $30 US. That's 3%, less than 3% of my salary at Princeton. And Shanghai's farmers was only paid 10% of what I was paid 34 years ago. Therefore, if the US people would find me at Princeton, they can hire 10. They can hire 30 me in Shanghai as a university professor, and 300 farmers in Shanghai. Therefore, there is no reason they would not come to Shanghai to invest. And Japan has some spare money, and Taiwan has finished its industrialization. It has its management skill in speaking the same Mandarin in working with the mainland side. And we have been working with such a best combination of globalization for the last 30 years. And the U.S. has benefited hugely. U.S. has accessed a huge amount of cheaper labor and purchased a huge amount of Chinese products. A few years ago, China's trade surplus was as high as 400 billion US dollar. Even in the last few years, still enjoyed more than 300 billion US dollars. And the US pay less to get more, and China access to US technology. And it's a way to manage our production. And we don't need to know how to sell, because the US people come to China to place order, and then we can sell our products easily. So these are the oldie goldie time of the globalization, but over time, US has suffered a huge amount of labor loss. And the U.S. is said to be able to build 5 ships a year now, and China can build 1,000 ships a year. So China, U.S. has transformed each of us in a very different direction. China has become a very powerful, competent country in industrialization. And the U.S. has been very powerful in those service sector, in financial, in those cutting-edge technology. But the U.S. has left those basic manufacturing for other countries like India, China to work. So we have had such kind of diversification in the last few decades. But now U.S. lots of complaint. Where is a job? Where is a work? Rich men become even richer, but lots of ordinary men become fired. They lose jobs. They are complacent, so they vote for J.D. Vance and they vote for Trump 2 times. And China thinks it's great. We did not force you to come to China. It's you who voluntarily come to China. So this is all a free market. And we don't intervene. So why your government would intervene into this free market? So you are not play the spirit of globalization. And we are working with a free market. But the U.S. side said, no. You intentionally keep, my battery may not be enough. I may soon run out of my battery. Wait for me for a minute.
So because Professor Shen will also need to recharge, so his battery. You have it. Oh, let's jump up a little bit. So, but Dr. Milzer, I have some follow-up questions for you. So, as we are waiting for Professor Shen's coming back, so I have one follow-up question is about the exemptions. So as we can see, the tariff, Trump's tariff have some exemptions or the exceptions, or I can see Canada and Mexico. And what kind of short-term and long-term implications that the exempting certain countries or certain products electrics like Apple's or laptops from tariffs for both the U.S. and China, because that's a really kind of a shining points from the Trump's tariffs. And so what kind of this short-term and long-term implication of these exemptions from Trump's tariffs? I really love to hear from you about this, some kind of exemptions from the Trump's tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, so you've seen that, when it comes to the China tariffs, the administration's already granted exclusions for semiconductors, for smartphones, computers, other electronics. It's kind of, they're recognizing that there's sort of no feasible pathway to replacing any of those supply chains, certainly in the near term, and that the costs of these tariffs would be pretty significant for consumers and for businesses. So that's, I think, it's important to look at what the administration is doing as well as what it is saying. And so I think if you look at what they're doing, we're seeing a little bit more like at some level it's not the Trump 1.0 administration, but this is basically the approach they took during the first Trump administration, where they granted a lot of exclusions from the tariffs on China. Now, obviously, the tariffs are a lot higher, so the products that are being tariffed, essentially are marketable in the United States currently, but there are a lot of exclusions. I'm not sure if you were asking about exclusions for countries as well, but that's the product exclusions.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. Yeah, because the exclusion at this before is really kind of interesting, because as we can see, there seems like have the high like the semiconductor industries, the CEOs like Jensen Huang was visit Beijing after the Trump has announced the H2O, like the chips exports restrictions. So that's they have some kind of negotiation or the huge kind of deal they want to reach. So that's I think that's really important to address that kind of questions. So another follow-up question is about the three kind of theories that are really interesting on the end game of the U.S. China. You were saying is more tension, more competition, and more kind of decoupling. But I have seen, that's my kind of IR theories knowledge. That's because the economic interdependence. So that's based on that kind of theories or this conceptions. I think the U.S.-China real decoupling is really impossible, because we have so many, the supply chains has been bonded together, and also like all the labors, as Professor Shen has been mentioned, and manufacturing, so far and so forth. So that's the more decoupling. So what that means, your meanings like most of the economy were decoupling, or you have seen is just one or two, or to some extent, some industries like semiconductors or other high sensitive industries, that's the US government have seen that, oh no, we don't want to cooperate with China. So that kind of industries will having the decoupling. So I want to clarify that of the, as you were mentioning, the end game of the US China.
Yeah, I think that the Trump administration is grappling with what every previous administration has been grappling with, as long as there's been this view that the US needs to be doing less with China, which is in what sectors and over what period of time. And the Biden administration had this concept of a small yard, high fence, which was the idea that it would be in some particular strategic sectors that mattered for national security and economic security, such as semiconductors, other core technologies where EVs, renewable energy, biotech, and so forth, where the US did not want to be kind of importing from China, dependent on China in any way, but the rest of the trading relationship could largely continue. The Trump administration has sort of, clearly not got that view, but I think they're sort of reverse engineering themselves back to something which will probably look a little like that, as they kind of grapple with the realities on the ground, which are that there's a lot of supply chains and products and manufacturing that the US is never going to produce. We don't have the labor, we don't have the land, there's no value add in making, laptops necessarily, or computers, or even TV screens and so forth. They're not national security issues, and there's only so much the US can make, and so forth. So I think that through the exemption process, you see a bit of that kind of returning to a more realistic view on what is possible. I think we haven't seen, we never really saw a clear articulation, I think, even during the Biden administration, of like what's actually the product range that kind of remains and can continue and that don't raise concerns. And we certainly have not seen any of that from the Trump administration. The high level kind of position at the moment, which is 145% tariffs on trade, on imports from China, suggests if that without exemptions would be a very rough, very economically disruptive decoupling of some sorts from the Chinese economy, right? You'd see leakage, and you would see reorientation of supply chains, and you would see goods entering the US through third countries. But you would see a lot of that bilateral trade, I think, begin to really significantly grind to a halt. So the exemption process suggests that that's not going to happen, and then there's clearly, I think, a desire to start a discussion between Trump and Xi on what they can do to sort of further reduce trade tensions. But we're going to see, but this is what gets back to my kind of original point, that whatever happens there, I think the ultimate trajectory is somewhat similar in that we're going to see some significant share of bilateral trade being squeezed as the US and China reorientate and focus on producing elsewhere and selling elsewhere. And then I think the question is going to become, what's the leakage? Like, where do Chinese products end up going? How might they get back into the US through Mexico, there's been a lot more attention, but also through Vietnam and Malaysia and Thailand, where there were supply chains and so forth. And what does the administration do about that? I think there's a real risk that a lot of other countries really get caught up in this pretty tough, but I think one-directional approach to China.
Great. I think Professor Shen was coming back, and I can ask Professor Shen, can you hear us pretty well? And you can also open your camera. We are kind of discussing the decoupling. I'm asking Dr. Milzer already about whether he brings the end game of U.S.-China relations. So I'm kind of a little bit challenge him his argument, whether or making more clarification on which the U.S.-China can really decoupling, because as we can see, we have a lot of trade bound together, and also even the manufacturings, and also even the labor's kind of factors. So I'm asking both of you can clarify whether the U.S.-China can really decoupling, or have some industries that the U.S. government thinking is really highly sensitive can be decoupled. Yeah, that's our now the status. So probably Professor Shen, you can raise your ideas. Maybe, yeah, we can. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. My view is such: the U.S. side, the White House does not want to decouple. It used the term reciprocal tariff in order to achieve reciprocal trade. The purpose is to balance the trade. The U.S. has had such a big trade deficit, and China has a huge trade surplus. So U.S. wants China to buy a lot more. I think President Trump wants China to buy more, and he does not want to kill the two-way trade. But so some people in the White House, they may want to decouple. And I think Chinese side does not want to decouple. But I think it's possible to decouple. Even if President Trump does not want to decouple, and President Xi Jinping does not want to decouple, but it is possible, very much possible to decouple if China can face more importantly than substance. So if China say tough words, and China hope the U.S. would bring first, and U.S. would show soft stance, so China would tell its people, we won. But actually China would yield more to the U.S. But Trump may want to be viewed as soft by his own team and by American people. Even if he want to make his first concession, but he could not politically do it. Therefore, the two leadership are unwilling to make the first step to reconcile, to make a concession, to bring first. Then it's truly possible to decouple. So they hate to decouple. That's my view.
Yeah, Thank you, Professor Shen. I think it is really interesting. You are raising the encompasses that both U.S. China has been facing right now, because like President Trump right now was waiting for President Xi Jinping's call. They really want to make a phone call and to negotiate directly via the video chat or the video call on that. But unfortunately, China didn't respond at least at the leaders level. But President Trump will really want like to go with the kind of leaders diplomacy. Yeah, Professor Chen, we can see. Yeah, and so far we have seen like they were stuck on the negotiation. So the following question is, I want to ask our both of the panelists, given this current impasses, what would it take bring the U.S. China back to the negotiation table, or how that's what do you think, like why they were the Trump's and Xi impossible call with a possible call was really hard to happen, and what maybe the factors or impacts to really make it difficult to happen. So probably Dr. Melzer, you can jump in, because you mentioned in your opening remarks on the kind of both of negotiation, and I think Dr. Shen also mentioned that each side don't want to make a concession at the first time. So maybe you can illustrate from the U.S. perspective, and then Dr. Melzer, you can jump in first, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's complicated because the optics of how these discussions start is clearly important to both Trump and Xi, and neither wants to be seen as making the first outreach, and in fear of that being interpreted, I think, in the negotiating context, but also domestically in each country as sort of a sign of weakness, and so that I think is making the initial steps difficult. There's obviously a lot of back channeling going on at the moment to try to engineer a conversation, but I think that's where we are at currently. I'm assuming that a way around this will eventually be found. I think, though, then the question ultimately, obviously, is what's the sort of range of possible outcomes for the US and China. And this is where I think that there is still, I think, an unresolved question when it comes to, certainly for Trump specifically, about what his ultimate view is of where he sees the US relationship with China. And the Biden administration had a very clear view of China and its strategy towards China, which was essentially that we're not going to try to change China. We accept China as it is. Certainly, when under a lifelong leader, President Xi, that things will until there's a change at the top, there's not going to be any change in the country, particularly, and that we need to kind of build around China, build our relationships with allies, develop alternative trading systems, and so forth. Trump's blown up that playbook in various ways, I think, and so. But the fact that he has imposed such high tariffs on China suggests either that this is all part of a larger negotiating tactic to eventually do some outcome or deal with China, or these tariffs ultimately are here for the longer term because, like the previous administration, they will see China as a long-term strategic competitor, and reducing trade investment is the kind of end goal, and tariffs are going to be a tool to achieve that. And I think depending on where Trump ultimately lands will depend on what any type of possible deal looks like. I'll just say two further things quickly. There has been for a while now and remains a strong bipartisan sort of approach to China, which is that China is a long-term strategic competitor. So I think there'll be a lot of political pushback for giving too much to China. So, for instance, unwinding export controls on sensitive technologies, any hint of undermining the US position vis-a-vis cross-strait relations would be, I think, a bridge too far, but I think would ultimately be important outcomes for Xi. if the US and China were to do a deal. So I think if we accept that those are unlikely to happen, then I think the opportunities for an outcome with China are more constrained and are probably going to look a lot more limited, and really might be in areas where the two countries can agree on areas of trade and investment that are less sensitive, that maybe can continue, but accepting that there's a lot of other areas where China's going to want to not be reliant on US technology, and the US doesn't want to be reliant on China, and each country will go in its own different directions. I think that's my sense is that's probably the ultimate end game. I don't think it's going to be a grand sort of bargain, but more like an attempt to ensure that the economic costs of reduced trade investment are sort of not too sharp and sudden, and that the relationship can continue on some footing, but a recognition that the US and China are headed into a sort of near medium-term future with ongoing strategic competition at their core.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Moser. I think it seems like a little bit pessimistic, a little bit, but I will love to hear Professor Shen. You also have this argument ready. So, do you have something to add on that? Maybe we can hear from you a little bit, like why they don't want to. Both sides don't want to make the first steps on negotiation or making the phone calls.
Because they have some wrong idea to take a first step in reconciling is a show of weakness. So neither side want to show some gesture which would be perceived as being weak. I think that's a wrong idea. And actually, President Xi Jinping may have called President Trump 2 times already, and he refused to admit. First, last November the 5th, when Donald Trump was re-elected, 2 days later, my leader made a phone call that he never admitted, but the Trump side announced. I think that's not a show of weakness, that's a show of friendliness. Why we don't tell people we are friendly? We are worried that people would think we want to, we are so weak, therefore we made a phone call to show that we are so nice to you. That's the wrong idea. China does the right thing, but China think in a wrong way. Second time, before January 20th, before the inauguration, President Xi Jinping made a phone call again to Trump. But again, he denied. And Trump announced it when he spoke online with the World Economic Forum. He said, Xi Jinping called him. He did not call Xi Jinping. But the Chinese official media said, at the request of US side, the 2 leaders made a phone call. I do not know which side is telling lie. So, in case President Xi made a 2-time phone call, I think that's a show of courage, a show of friendship, a show being nice, not a show of being weak. Why he could not show his greatness, his strength, not weakness, by making the phone call for the 3rd time to President Trump again. My friend, my brother, I want to negotiate with you. That's not a show of weakness. But I think he and his team may have misunderstood. They always do good things, but they always think other people would think the good thing is a weak thing. That's wrong. People like me and other people should encourage Chinese leader to make a phone call, to beat Trump by calling first by showing our strength first, not showing our weakness by not placing the call. That's my view. So I hope if Trump would think he is weak because he is waiting for a phone call, then Chinese side would think that's right. He is weak and we are strong. But in my view, to be strong, to be weak is nonsense. To be responsible for people in America, in China, to trade, to have a normal relationship. For instance, next year, China will still export up to 500 billion, half a trillion US dollar equivalent to China's goods to US after the settlement of the new talk. But the US would significantly increase its sale to China from current 160 billion to probably 300 billion. 100% increase through this tariff war. So China increased importation significantly, and China maintains the current level of exportation, reducing the trade difference significantly. That gives face to Trump. That made his people to respect him. That also would make me to respect my leader even more because he sustained our current level of export to China, so our economy would not decline. Otherwise, the two countries could truly decouple. Our direct shipment to US would diminish. Our transshipment to US would drastically decline, and the US export to China would diminish. But that's amount only to 5% of US total export. Our direct export to the US is 15% of total China total export. So who would suffer more? It's China, not the US. So to care our own people, we should place a call. That's a show of responsibility.
Yeah, that's I totally agree, Dr. Shen. It is kind of a call of the responsibility they have to back to the negotiation table. I think it is benefits for both countries and both kind of people, but we still need to look forwards and to finding out a realistic kind of pathway for both sides or both U.S. and Chinese leaders back to the negotiation table, even though they were based on the showing whether they were caring about concerning about theirs is making the first step is showing the weakness to their rivalry. So, but we still need to find a realistic pathway to this escalation of this the tariff war. So, probably I have another follow-up question for both of our panelists. How might is there a realistic pathway for the escalation of this back and forth tariffs retaliations, and or both sides can lock into a prolonged economic conflict? Maybe as Dr. Melzer said, they have some back channel or the high level economic officials. The back channel can do the negotiation. Or do you have any realistic pathway, Dr. Melzer? Maybe you have some thoughts on that. Because also referring to the 90 pause days of the tariffs, maybe they having something negotiation ready, like Japan or like in South Korea. Maybe they have some implication on that. Maybe you can elaborate, Dr. Melzer.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I kind of outlined this a little in my previous response, but what I will add is that what happens over the next 90 days as the US tries to do these bilateral deals with various countries, I think will be an important signal of what ultimately probably transpires between the US and China. If and think about this in two ways. One is that getting to a deal itself is, I think, going to be critical if the US is going to demonstrate that its approach so far is actually going to produce outcomes for the US. And also getting to a deal, I think, is going to be important if it's going to begin the process of trying to rebuild a little bit of the concern that it's raised, particularly in Europe and Japan and South Korea, other key allies and partners, which will be important if you think about, ultimately the US needs partners and allies in its approach to China. The other part is what's the actual content of the deals, and this is where I think China coming out earlier this week and sort of saying that they're going to oppose deals that harm China is important, because I think it's clear that the Chinese side understands that, you know, there's a scope here for the US to push countries to do things which not only are going to be about opening markets to US products and dealing with trade barriers, but are going to bring in a broader range of issues that could include their long-term relations with China. The reality is that for almost every country in Southeast Asia, their major trading partner is China. And so none of these countries, I think, are in any position or want to be in any position where they have to make choices between the United States and China. And I think the US side would be foolish to be forcing these countries to make that decision. Right, everyone in Southeast Asia wants to be able to have good economic relations with China and good economic relations with the United States. So I think ultimately for the US, the goal really should be, building their opportunity to build strong and durable economic relations with the United States, and as a way of giving these countries economic choice and options, right, instead of being too dependent on one particular country. But looking at what these deals contain, I think will tell us a lot about ultimately how the US is thinking about what it wants from China. I think I do think that we will, so the escalation that's kind of gone on over the last couple of weeks is got two elements to it. One is that Trump said very early on, if any countries retaliate, we're going to escalate. So I think he felt that as China retaliated, he had to follow through and escalate. And he had to do that in part because one of the risks to the United States broadly from this entire strategy around raising tariffs on everyone is that the costs, should other countries retaliate, the costs of this approach become, they're magnified in multiple ways. And the tariffs are already raising a lot of investment concerns about inflationary impacts and so forth. So the Trump administration is trying to minimize the disruption that the US economy is going to go through as they try to put in more tariffs. And part of that is, essential to that is to prevent retaliation. So their strong kind of escalation in response to China was also very much about sending a signal to the rest of the world that we will do this if you retaliate, right? So I think what we saw was this cycle that the US sort of felt it had to engage in as China retaliated. I think that we're sort of at this tariff level now where China has said, look, we're not going to escalate further, in part because at some point you're talking about numbers, 140%, 160, 200%. There's no viable trade in any of these numbers, right? So I think it's completely sensible for China to sort of call a halt to the need to kind of escalate further. I don't think both countries are in a place where they want to be when it comes to bilateral trade. So I do think there is a desire on both sides to ratchet down tariffs, to ratchet down tensions. But the ultimate question is, what does that look like? And I get back to my original response, where I think we remain on a trajectory when it comes to US-China relations, where there will be less and less trade in a category of goods which is still yet to be defined, but broadly speaking will fall under the umbrella of economic and national security for both countries, where there will just be less integration. And you can talk about what those sectors clearly are: semiconductors, high-end technology, forms of biotechnology and so forth, but there will be others as well. But there was going to be a reasonably broad range of products that will continue. And, I think that's the negotiation, right? What does that look like ultimately? Where do tariffs come down and so forth? The final thing I'll say is, if you look at the phase one trade deal that the Trump administration did with China, that included these purchasing commitments for agriculture. It's possible the Trump administration, there were two things that were going on there. One is that it's possible the Trump administration looks to do that again. I think a lot of people think that's a bad idea, but it's not. It's something they may seek to do. And the other thing is that there was always meant to be a phase two deal, which was going to include China making various reforms and market openings. I don't know whether that's genuinely going to be on the table. Again, I think that what China would want in return might be very difficult for the US to deliver, but that's sort of an area of uncertainty where there may be some progress, but it's hard to know.
Oh, thank you. I think Dr. Mercer, I believe that the less integration maybe would be a best kind of framing of the U.S.-China relations, but we still don't know. Actually, there's a 90 days pause date for the tariffs, and we glad to see whether they have something negotiation will happen on the table or under the table. But we have another question. As you mentioned, other countries. So that's the question related to the themes, the semi-globalization, which means the regional blocs or the other new trade alliance were forming to bypass the U.S. tariffs. As we can see, recently China visits a couple Southeast Asian countries like Cambodia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, and also recently, just in the past few weeks, we have seen China, Japan, and South Korean, three countries met for their first economic dialogues in 5 years, to discuss the tariffs, the negative or the profound impact on their economy. So what that means for the future of global supply chains, if they have so that's the kind of meaning of the semi-globalization, or either the China or other Asian country will belong together and having their supply chain, or as you probably previously mentioned, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico or other countries in the Trump's tariffs examination will come together, have another globalization or another regional blocks of economy. So it's that we are witnessing the birth of the semi-globalization, where this is also happening. What's kind of your view on that? Maybe Dr. Moser, I would love to hear about you, because that's stemming from your thoughts on your previous comments on that.
I think that look clearly what the Trump administration has done in the last 13 weeks has raised a lot of concerns across capitals, friends and allies, competitors, and so forth. And so it is to be expected that countries are going to look to hedge a little bit against US uncertainty and to seek to build alternative options. And you're seeing that in Europe as well, and so forth. And China is clearly going to try to make the most of this moment to be, the alternative partner of choice for countries. So I expect to see that continue, and I think that's a real risk to the US from its current approach. I think there are real challenges and limits to probably what China can achieve at the moment. It's hard to, this is in the short term. I think how this ultimately plays out will sort of depend on where Trump goes over the next 6-12 months and what it ultimately looks like. But I think that China, when it comes to Europe, confronts a lot of real challenges, including its support for Russia in its war in Ukraine. There's a major concern about overcapacity in China and diversion of even more Chinese exports to Europe as the US market closes down there. So I think kind of making progress there is going to be very challenging. Japan and particularly, but also South Korea have obviously security concerns and territorial concerns vis-a-vis China. And so these issues continue. And so I think, I think progress will be in a meaningful way with a lot of these countries for China will be hard. But I do think that it is clear that for a lot of these countries, they need to sort of at least signal that they're speaking to China and they're creating options for themselves so that they don't sort of feel like beholden or so exposed to Trump and sort of what's going on there. So that will continue. I think the ultimate, how this actually lands in a longer term way will really depend a lot on where the US ends up, right? Like if this sort of resolves itself into some comprehensive, stable new regime that countries kind of can live with and that makes some sense and that are not sort of then I think we're in a better place. But I think if it's a continuation of highly erratic, tariffs and threats and declining confidence in the US, then I think we'll see more of this hedging take place, and I think more scope for China to build more durable relationships with other countries.
Right. I think it also kind of depends. I really totally agree with Dr. Melzer. It also depends on whether it's a short term or it's a long term. Whether if it is a long term or continuation of the tariffs, maybe there is more room for China to get a lot of friends on Southeast Asia or other trading partners, even in Latin America. So what's your Dr. Shen's thoughts or reaction to that? Maybe China is creating, or the US China or is going to create their own regional clubs with different trading partners. Have you seen this kind of a trend where it's already shaped, or is being shaped? What's your thoughts, Dr. Shen?
If U.S.-China unfortunately decouple their economic and trade relationship, then it's hard to imagine what kind of a China-centered semi-globalization. I can understand the US-centered semi-globalization. US already with globalization, every year has a lot of trade surplus, and the US benefits as a country by buying more and exporting less. Even though the absolute amount of U.S. export is still a lot, about 3 trillion, and the U.S. Import is 4 trillion. But for China, China's total trade surplus is 1 trillion. And 1/3 of them is from the U.S. If China would end its trade relationship with U.S., and China still wants to enjoy the previous level of trade surplus, then China would make other countries, the other semi-sphere, unable to absorb China's actual export. They don't have the market to absorb China's extra export. They would feel it's a burden. Probably they would collectively wage a trade war with China by refusing China to export lots of good quality but cheaper priced and even more cheaper stuff, given more subsidy. So such China-centered semi-globalization is not sustainable. Or the previous US-Soviet kind of semi-globalization. Soviet Union has its centered satellite sphere, 10 country, 20 country, Warsaw Pact, etc. But for that, Soviet Union gave a lot of aid for the 20, Mongolia, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and China, Vietnam, and North Korea. But if China would give global south 150 countries the amount of aid that the former Soviet Union used to give for 10, 20 countries, China would be exhausted. China totally is unable to provide a resource for 150 countries. So for either type of China-centered semi-globalization, neither of them is sustainable. And China should avoid to be situated in such a kind of semi-globalization. Therefore, I still hope China would work out some addition with Trump 2.0, either making a phone call, losing face, but cutting loss by giving face to Trump. But I would say China gain face. Making first phone call is not losing face, but is brave, is earning face. I would give China have a new definition. And then we should return to the pre-Trump 2.0 time. US last time Trump left 20% in average tariff on China. Before January 20th this year, US tariff on China 20%. China's average tariff is 10%. Globally, international community accepts China 10%. And then for 5 years, from 20 to 25, China accepts the US 20% tariff on China. So 20% is nothing. And Trump has imposed 10% of base tariff is nothing. This new world structure can totally commensurate Trump's 10% of base tariff. And for 20%, China has accustomed to 20% with US for 5 years. Why EU, other country cannot be accustomed to the Trump 20-25% for the next 5 years? So I think his team has smartly calculated 10 to 20% is something that globally the community of country can accept. But more than 25% is the punishment. Primarily to punish Vietnam, to punish other East Asian countries. They have been tapped by China for transshipment. If they would be careful, they would still have some transshipment, but they would be careful so China can make less benefits from it. So China has to make even better relation by importing more from US. Therefore, China would save its time to transship from the third country. I think this is a calculation of Trump. In my view, China can manage it. China can face. Trump need to call China first to say he is weak, he lose face. And my leader, my president is strong, earn face. Then the two sides would smile and they would work out a fashion. China probably would reduce its average tariff from 10% to 5%. And we work out with the US on the 10% of tariff now. So Trump should reduce 20% he imposed in 2020 to reduce it to 10%. If China would significantly import more from US, from 160 billion to 300 billion, and investing a lot more, I think all these are totally manageable. It's a matter of faith.
Great. Thank you, Professor Shen. I totally agree. Neither of them, neither US nor China can think semi-globalization is sustainable. But as we can see, like the time flows really fast. We're going to close this session. So I will ask each panelist having this closing remarks, whether probably looking ahead, what's the greatest risk under this new trade reality, and then one kind of piece advice for the both countries, especially for policymakers and or entrepreneurs. Maybe that's what really great part to get an end of our session. Maybe Dr. Melzer, maybe starting from you.
Thanks, John. I'll be brief, and then I'm going to have to jump because I'm late for another call. Look, I think the greatest risk is that we don't end up in a productive outcome along the ones that I outlined, and that we actually see economic and trade relations with China remaining, the tensions being elevated and the tariffs being elevated. There's a lot that can kind of derail what could potentially be a reasonably productive, I think, bilateral conversation between the two leaders, including politics in their own country. You can imagine a number of events happening in addition to that globally that might make this more challenging than otherwise. So I think it's a high risk environment. I think that there's a real possibility where you have an outcome here which is still significant tariffs, but a lot reduced from where they are at, a lot more targeted and focused, and perhaps like creating opportunities for cooperation in other areas. I think that would be a great outcome. I think it's a realistic outcome, but I think there's a real risk that we don't get there, and that tensions between China and the US remain very elevated. Thank you so much for having me, and sorry I have to run, but it's been a real pleasure and a great pleasure to have the conversation with Professor Shen as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Melzer. I know you need to run, and I need to thank you for coming, and we will catch up later, and then see you maybe in the near future when we have in person or on virtual conversation like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Bye-bye.
Run up your final comments on that. Maybe naming one greatest risk of the U.S.-China relations, especially from the economy perspective, and also offer one of the piece of advice for both US or China's global leaders for business?
The risk for China is if we don't work out the trade relationship in a few months, the domestic internal tension, the lack of international business order, the more unemployment situation and its development would become more down spiraling, and that endangers social stability. For the U.S. is if Trump could not manage its China tariff and a global tariff, U.S. Inflation would go high, that would endanger his first year performance. And if this would go on, then he would lose the trust of people, and that present a huge amount of challenge for his midterm election, for his party to manage their leadership in both chambers of the Congress. So that he has internal challenge, we have internal challenge. And then if both sides lose temper, there are plenty of regional security challenges in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, in our part of the world. That's very dangerous. So we need to fix the trade imbalance to make a relatively a more happy ending.
Yes. And thank you, Dr. Shen. And maybe we have a great conversation, and maybe we can see whether in the 90 days, the tariff pause days will have some negotiation would happen, and also like they can lift it the like really drastically high tariffs in the near future, and we can see both of the global leaders can sit down and on the negotiation table whether to withdraw any like the pride or other kind of concerns from their domestic, and to deal with these issues is really critical. Thank you both, Dr. Milzer and also Dr. Shen, and we really appreciate on behalf of CGHK, we're grateful for your comments, insights, and elaboration on this really important issues on the tariffs, which can relate it to most of the business in China and in the US were doing, or other policymakers who were struggling with these issues. Yeah, we really appreciate your thoughts. And thank you, and we will see if any progress has been made, and we will have another conversation like this virtually or in person. Please stay tuned on our accounts, and we will post this the recorded session on our CGHK account. So
Thank you.
have a good evening, and thank you everybody who's coming, and then see you next time. Bye. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Dr. Shen.